All right, well, thank you so much for having me here. I ought to start with a confession, which is that I'm not, in fact, the greatest man in the world. And I learned this from my 7-year-old last year when he came up to me at home and said, "Daddy, I'm sorry, but you are not the world's greatest man." And I said, "How dare you, of course. Who is?" And he said, it's George Washington. He's the greatest man in the world because there'd be no America without him. He beat the British. He didn't quite see the irony of telling me this, but... And I thought, that's great. Genuinely, that's great. And I said, well, how about me now? And he said, you're number 2. So that's pretty good, right? Number 2. So we agreed that was a reasonable compromise. And then a few months later, he said to me, look, I'm sorry, I've got some bad news for you. You're no longer number 2 in the great man stakes because Abraham Lincoln is number 2. He'd done that at school. So I'm down to 3, but I've never been more happy to be knocked down the charts of the greatest men who've ever lived because clearly he's being taught at school that George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and the country that he was born into are great and worthy of admiration, and that is something as a parent, of course, that I worry about, as we all do.
Wait until he learns about Churchill. He'll be knocked off the podium altogether.
I'm in serious trouble as he progresses, providing we can keep this going, which is the challenge ahead of us. So by the time he gets to college, I think this will be more difficult and more difficult. I also worry that if he does start to knock those people off his list of great men, I won't replace them. I will also go down with them. And I want to start with your experience. We won't dwell completely on this, but at Georgetown, obviously that is different than my 7 and 8-year-old school, but many of the same problems obtain. So if you want to fill the audience in if anyone isn't familiar with what happened, and then we can talk about
I don't know, does your
what that
7-year-old school have crying rooms? Because that's what the Georgetown law students asked for to deal with the trauma of my offensive tweets. Thanks to the Federal Society and DFI for having me. And you see the problem with American higher education and legal education. They had to get 2 foreigners to discuss constitutional and civil rights protections, because we do a job that most Americans, this room excluded, presumably, aren't willing to do. So this is really the story of how I became a higher ed expert. It's really remarkable, this country. It really is the American dream. 3 years ago, I ran unsuccessfully for school board in Falls Church, Virginia, and so I'm a K-12 expert now. And then I quit Georgetown, and so I'm a higher ed expert. That kept falling up ever since. So I'd been at the Cato Institute for nearly 15 years and thought I'd try something else. Got a really interesting offer from Randy Barnett at Georgetown to head up their Center for the Constitution, which we've learned is all the more important because the rest of the law school is a center against the Constitution. But anyway, a few days before I was to assume that job was when news of Justice Breyer's retirement broke. Judicial politics, Supreme Court nominations, that was the subject of my last book, still available for sale, Supreme Disorder, paperback edition, updated. And so I was doing media all that day. I happened to be on the road in Austin, Texas. And late that night, bad practice, not a best practice. I was in my hotel room doom scrolling Twitter and was getting upset with people's discussion of the Supreme Court fight to come, and particularly that the president was keeping to his campaign promise to appoint a black woman, to limit his criteria by race and sex. And so I tweeted out that opposition, which is shared by 76% of Americans, apparently, in a poll by that rabid right-wing outlet ABC News. I didn't use the best language. It wasn't the most carefully crafted, hot-take, late-night tweet ever. And I went to bed, and overnight a firestorm broke. Long story short, I was suspended, investigated for 4 months to see whether I had harassed or discriminated against anyone, and then reinstated on the technicality that, some junior lawyer at WilmerHale, who they'd hired and paid probably $1 million to help with my investigation, looked at a calendar and saw that I wasn't an employee when I tweeted. But then I got the report from their diversity office, known at Georgetown as IDEA, Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, which made clear that if ever I offended anyone ever again, I'd be back in the Inquisition, and I couldn't tolerate that, so I quit and made what lawyers call a noisy exit, and have been using the platform I've been given ever since to talk about that kind of a liberalism that I've discovered. You can read about all of that saga in more detail in my forthcoming best-selling book, Lawless. Best-selling if all of you buy it, Lawless, okay? Or on my Substack, for that matter, Shapiro's Gavel. But that, in a nutshell, is what it is. And, you know, I thought I wasn't naive when I was joining higher ed, when I was coming to Georgetown. I speak at law schools frequently. But it was still eye-opening about, you know, the willingness to subvert, forget, you know, left-wing bias in academia or something. My story, neither what I tell more broadly in the book, nor my personal one, is not a part and parcel of the decades-old conservative complaint about hippies taking over the faculty lounge at Berkeley in the 60s. Instead, it's the illiberal takeover and subversion of classical liberal values, due process, free speech, equal protection, the whole core truth-seeking mission of higher education.
So I want to know where you think that this comes from. Because people often assume when I talk about this topic that I saw a lot of this when I was in college, but I didn't. I was the early 2000s. It was, at Oxford, an extremely liberal in the good sense environment. I never had a professor who objected to my politics, such as I had any. I never saw people shouting each other down. All of the buzzwords that we hear day in, day out, they weren't there. The first time that I saw this was the year after I left. There were two things that happened within a year. One, the Oxford Union, which is a debating society, invited a guy called Nick Griffin to come and speak. Nick Griffin is a British fascist, essentially. He's quite a silly man, really, but he has obnoxious fascistic views, and they'd invited him to debate. It's a debating society. It is described in Britain as the last bastion of free speech in the country. It was set up in the 19th century when a lot of universities, including Oxford, still had a sort of religious circumstance. And this was a place where people could go within Oxford, but not within the university, to debate. So they invited Nick Griffin. That wasn't that out of the ordinary. And there were people blocking the entrance in balaclavas with signs that said "No free speech for fascists," which is pretty ironic. And the people in the balaclavas were supposed to be the good guys, and this just blew my mind because this had never occurred to me, and they disinvited him. He never got to speak. The next thing I saw was I had a girlfriend at the time who was at Middlebury College in Vermont, and I went to visit her there. And there was a poster that someone had put up that was a debate over radical Islam, and it had a picture of the Twin Towers on fire on it. And this caused such a storm on the campus that they had to hold this big meeting in this theater that they had with a movie screen on it. Because apparently the mere fact of showing this image was bigotry and created a hostile environment and so on. And again, I just had absolutely I went along to watch this. I had absolutely no idea what it was that they were talking about. So, as someone who went through college, I didn't see any of this, but then you fast forward and you tweeted outside of work about politics in a topic that directly affects your job, and you end up getting pulled in front of all these committees. Where did that come from, Ilya?
So there are a number of factors here. There's the kind of changing mentality, in part driven by social media and smartphones, that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have discussed. Certain inflection points that have polarized our politics and inflamed it, going back about 10 years. There is the story of bureaucracy, which is the untold story, because it's not sexy. But already, I graduated college 26 years ago now. It had started growing then, but then it just accelerated. The ratio of non-teaching staff to faculty or to students just exploded across higher education. At first, this was kind of student life people, safetyism, holding students' hands, as well as those that helped administer, the climbing walls and the lazy rivers and kind of the race to compete for students with accoutrements like that. But then, starting about 10 years ago, it became in the DEI space and kind of the bureaucratic apotheosis of critical theory, not just critical race theory, but the queer theory that Bob was alluding to. In general, these theories that didn't originate 10 years ago, they originated in the 30s and 40s, and Derrida and all of these postmodern Marcuse and all these things that germinated in various ways in legal education. We had thought, I started law school in the year 2000, and we had thought that critical theory stuff was some blip from the 80s and 90s, and it was now relegated to some niche corner of the sociology department. But then it reared its ugly head again and exploded through the bureaucracy. And so now, in many places, including especially our most elite institutions, there are more non-teaching staff, more educrats or diversicrats than students. I don't know whether that, the joke is at Yale 100 years ago, students came with their own personal butlers. Maybe now with all of these bureaucrats, they're going to get their own personal butlers again. But anyway, so there's the story of the students, there's the story of the bureaucracy, and then the story of the kind of activism that has reemerged pedagogically such that the modern generation, let's say, again, we skip over my Gen X, but the boomer liberals are being, who kind of, even if they're on the left, have a more kind of classical liberal approach, being replaced by millennials who see their job as activism rather than education. Those are kind of the three big trends that we've seen.
So is this an elite problem, or is this a problem that has filtered down into normal American society? And I ask this because, obviously, what you essentially tweeted was a criticism of affirmative action. And affirmative action, you said 73% of
76.
people. Yeah. And when the Supreme Court case came down last year, it was nearly 80% approval. But there are two competing civil rights visions there, in that if you look at the way your case unfolded, or if you just look at the debates over the Supreme Court's decision, the two sides both think that they're on the side of the angels. I mean, I look at this and I think, just don't racially discriminate. That is the principle against affirmative action, that there is nothing good about discriminating against people on the basis of their skin color or sex or anything else. But it's not that the people who are doing that discrimination think that they're discriminating. They're not Southern segregationists in 1850 who would openly sort of racially conscious in that way. They think they're doing this great work. So, I mean, is that difference, is this something that is a live debate in the public at large, or do you think this is an elite versus the masses problem?
Well, there's really two questions there. One is elite versus non-elite, and one is academia versus the real world,
okay,
as it were. These trends are most pronounced or most alarming, perhaps, in the elite institutions because, whether you're looking at law schools or anything else, though the more elite you get, the more you're going to get the people who are tomorrow's judges and partners at Fortune 500 or AmLaw 200 firms, general counsels at Fortune 500 companies, elected officials, the gatekeepers of our political and legal institutions. So that's more important in that way. But it's definitely, you see instances in so-called lower-ranked schools all over the place, particularly with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, does these speech rankings, and it does seem like the Ivy League tends to cluster, and Georgetown tends to cluster towards the lower ranks, but you can see these phenomenon all over the place. In terms of society writ large, it used to be said that, oh, well, this campus craziness, whatever, these students will graduate, they'll grow up, they'll join the real world, and this will evaporate. And the problem is it doesn't evaporate. They instead, are the shock troops in corporations that their bosses start fearing and all the rest of it. We've seen that dynamic. However, in society writ large, I think we have seen a pushback, or the pendulum swinging back as kind of normal people who aren't constantly online, who aren't politically obsessed, who have real jobs and real lives and aren't commenting on this stuff like you and I, notice this, are forced to notice these weird things going on, and they say, that's not right. The emperor has no clothes. And so in for society writ large, I'm with Brett Kavanaugh, who said at his hearings that I live on the sunrise side of the mountain. I think there might be self-regulating mechanisms there that we're seeing in corporate America and other places. But in academia, there's no regulator, there's no check. And often the left hand doesn't know or is afraid of what the far left hand is doing. And so the only way to have any sort of correction is externally, through what economists would call exogenous shocks. But that's why we've seen, I think, to the good, especially after October 7th, alumni and trustees, employers, even judges as employers of law clerks, state legislators getting involved, because deans and presidents and department chairs are not going to be reasoned with to take a better approach. They're going to have to, because the thing is about these educational bureaucrats, as I've been describing them, most of them, the DEI officers are themselves, but the presidents, the provosts, the deans are not generally woke radicals. They're spineless cowards. They've climbed the greasy pole and they respond to their incentives. So they have to be shown that there's a cost to placating the braying mob, and that's how any sort of change can be achieved.
So how do we work out the balance between civil rights and free speech? Because often they are at odds, and even with what we've been seeing on college campuses, with what you could really only describe as praise for Hamas in many cases, you do have a case there that some of the speech on campus from those protesters actually does create a hostile environment. I mean, you've seen Colombia, people shouting, globalize the Intifada, or telling Jewish students to go home. How do we reconcile that? Because I think most people in this room, I assume, would say that they are both for civil rights, at least as we understand it, and also for free speech, but they do come up against each other.
Yeah, they do and they don't. It depends how you properly understand these different conceptions. And in fact, when Dean Traynor, Bill Traynor at Georgetown, ultimately resolved my case, he put out this long statement talking about why this was so difficult because of this tension between these two values that we hold so high: free speech on the one hand and non-discrimination and equity on the other. Well, maybe there is a tension with equity. Former dean, now provost at Stanford, Jenny Martinez, wrote a big memo that everyone should read after the Kyle Duncan brouhaha last year, saying that DEI practiced correctly does not impede on free speech. Well, I'm not sure that's right. I think every DEI professional would disagree with that, at least how it's practiced. But the point is, I wrote about this for the Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication last fall, that speech is speech. Speech is not violence. On the other hand, violence is violence. Violence is not speech. And so if something is pure speech, it can be the most offensive, hateful, what have you. That is constitutionally protected. And most schools at this point, thanks in large part to the good efforts of FIRE, do have very good on paper or pixels speech and expression policies. Georgetown certainly does. And that puts paid to what Traynor wrote because, if you can read their policy, it's pretty short. It says if someone's offended, basically, that's tough. We don't have a heckler's veto. People who are opposed can't veto things. But the three buckets that you have to think about these things, and this comes up especially in higher ed on campus, but not necessarily, and we can get to that in a moment. But first of all, there is non-speech. So assault, vandalism, that sort of thing. Even if you're doing it for an expressive purpose, not protected. The most creative example of this I've seen was somebody urinated on a Hillel and was arrested and claimed, I was expressing myself. Well, no. Second, there is speech that is not protected, either by the First Amendment or by campus policies that mirror the First Amendment. And that is things like incitement of violence, and there's a very high bar that the Supreme Court jurisprudence has defined what that means, or true threats. A Cornell student was arrested and prosecuted, and I think he's now been punished, sentenced, for true threats of rape and death and things like this. And then there are time, place, and manner regulations. So all universities say that whatever you do, even if you're fully protected core political speech, you can't disrupt classrooms, you can't disrupt student organizations that have registered and booked a room for a speaker, can't disrupt that. You can't interfere with the normal programs, the educational programs of the institution. When you get to the real world outside of campus, that's things like time, place, and manner regulations include things like not blocking streets. I don't care why you're blocking the street, whether it's to be expressive, political, or artistic, or otherwise, you can't do it. Core political speech, right? I can't go to your neighborhood in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning and with a bullhorn tell you exactly what I think of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. That's disturbing the peace, and properly so, even though it's core political speech. So those are the buckets. Non-speech, speech that's not protected, which is narrow, and time, place, and manner regulations. You mentioned harassment or hostile environment. It's kind of a controversial and somewhat not fully defined issue because a lot of it is fact-specific in the educational context. There's a case called Davis, which talks about severe and pervasive. So if you're just having a rally, that's one thing. If you're having a rally that targets the Hillel on campus or surrounds Jewish students or something like that, that's another.
How much should we use government to address this problem? There was a piece that blew my mind 6 months ago or so at CNN by a representative from the NAACP who said that the mere fact that the presidents of Harvard and MIT and Penn had been brought in front of Congress was interference with those universities. And that astonished me because the Congress that they were invited to had appropriated about $4 billion in the last 3 years more for Harvard. And there is a point, obviously, at which if you are going to send out taxpayers' money, you have the right to, at the very least, ask questions. The asking questions bit's probably not controversial, other than for that op-ed writer. But conservatives especially, since 1978, have wanted to get rid of the Department of Education. Ronald Reagan ran on this in 1980. He didn't get this done. And there is a divide between those who say get rid of it and feel it's somehow sort of dirty to use it if you want to get rid of it, and then others who say, no, if we win elections, we get all of the powers that are available to us. What is your view on how much government can and should be used to address the sort of issues that you've just outlined?
Well, even if we got rid of the Department of Education, 99% of whose activities are unconstitutional, we'd still have government involvement in education at the state level. So federalism doesn't answer the whole question here. With respect to Congress, with respect to the federal government, Hillsdale, which doesn't accept any federal funds, whether research funds or student loans or anything, has a lot more freedom in this regard. They don't have strings attached by the federal government because they're not taking any federal money. But these other schools do get a lot of money, and there are tremendous strings attached. Most of them non-political. Most of them are, regarding being transparent in your accounting, making sure there's no fraud. There's also, you have to comply with federal anti-discrimination law. I testified before the House Education Committee last year about First Amendment strings. And indeed, you don't need to legislate further or add further strings to threaten to withhold and ultimately withhold funds based on speech violations, because speech is a civil right in various ways. You could strengthen it in various regards, but I think Congress is fully within its powers to question university presidents and others. And it's not just been those three. That was a pivotal moment for sure that has thrust this issue and this academic illiberalism into the national debate. But that committee has had roles of other university presidents to the good. I think we can use more of that. The strings with threatening federal funding, the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education investigates these groups and has them remediating violations of student rights. There can be lawsuits for violating Title VI, which says that if a school denies equal access to educational opportunities, lawsuits against both private and public schools in that regard. But then the second part of that's at the federal level. The second part is how much can state governments be involved? And here, the governments, especially of Florida and Texas, have passed various legislation regulating, some people say micromanaging, some people say violating academic freedom. And here you have to delineate between structuring or overseeing state schools, where it's perfectly appropriate to say, well, University of State University, we're going to focus on these departments. We don't need women's studies. That's not we don't get the bang for the buck there. On the other hand, this other school, this is state tech. We're only going to have STEM here. We don't want a history department here. This is just STEM, kind of regulating those departments, how to organize and structure your universities. That's one thing and perfectly within the powers of a state legislature. Once that legislature starts trying to regulate what professors can and can't say, or students can and can't say in classrooms, that's where they get into some problems. But certainly bureaucratic decisions and what to fund, which offices to fund, shutting down DEI offices, for example, as I think 14 states now have passed legislation, and there's been some executive orders beyond that. That's perfectly fine. That's a decision with taxpayer dollars, how you're going to structure your state institutions.
So you mentioned Florida. The Stop Woke Act was the controversial law. What is your view on the provision in that said you can't teach, I don't want to use the word concept, but you can't promulgate in the classroom the idea that races are superior or inferior to one another. Because the people who wrote it, passed it, and then Governor DeSantis, who signed it, say, look, that is essentially an issue of equality. It's a civil rights issue. We don't want to have people in state institutions who are being told by their teachers, because you're white, you're collectively guilty, or because you're a man, you're collectively guilty. But then there's a lot of pushback, and they say, well, okay, but that is doing what you just described, which is telling people what they can and can't say. Where's the line there?
Well, academic freedom, whether in terms of kind of professional norms or under the First Amendment, doesn't require professors to be able to say whatever they want in their classroom. If a chemistry professor starts talking about their views on the true causes of World War II or something like this, that's not germane to what they're supposed to be teaching, and so there can be consequences, administrative consequences for that. So there are line drawing issues, and Charlie had a very good interview on his podcast with Keith Whittington, who recently moved from Princeton to Yale Law School, because the dean of Yale Law School, Heather Gerken, wanting to be the president of Yale or Princeton or Harvard, knows that she has to reform Yale's out-of-control culture, so she hired Keith Whittington as a senior scholar, another junior scholar at the law school who are not progressives, trying to change things. Anyway, but that was a good discussion of, it's a line-drawing issue. And at a certain point, there was a very good hypothetical. What if there are actual Nazis who have taken over the political science department and then only hire, because faculty in one department is responsible for hiring their successors and whatnot, only hire actual Nazis? Well, it's tricky. One thing you can do is set up stop the money flowing to that department and start it going to another one without necessarily saying you can't talk about that in that way. But certainly it's improper for universities to teach activism rather than to teach education of any kind. But that doesn't necessarily mean, there's problems with the Stop Woke Act, probably more as applied than just having kind of a facial challenge saying the whole thing is unconstitutional.
Yeah, so the book that Keith Whittington just wrote that we were talking about essentially makes the case that academic freedom, at least in state universities, is constitutionally mandatory as well as being good in and of itself. And I'm going to ask you the same question I asked him on this. I mean, he made a case in the book and on my podcast that was doctrinal more than anything else. And he acknowledged that until really the Cold War, the view in the United States was that state institutions, state universities, could hire and fire people at will without implicating the First Amendment rights of staff. And you were a hired man, and if you had political views, whatever they were, that the college didn't like, or the state legislature didn't like, or that a majority of voters didn't like, you could be got rid of. And I asked him this, what is the originalist case here? Is there an originalist case for this sort of First Amendment jurisprudence? What's your view on that?
I think if it's a state school, then the state has a lot more leverage over it because there is an element of state speech there. The state can't be forced to hire, in the history department, one faculty member from each of the leading 12 streams of historical methodology or something like this. There are constraints that aren't there for private institutions, even private institutions that receive government funding, or at least federal funding. So I don't have a clear answer for you on this, but I do think that there's, it's not improper for the state legislature to say, okay, new college is in the news. We don't like that department, that it's not adding any value. It's, students are declining, student enrollment is declining. We're just not going to have that department anymore. Maybe it's better for the trustees, for that matter, to make that decision rather than the state legislature. But of course, that's just a different level of government, because trustees are acting in that state school for as state actors determining the governance. And that's a good point as well. Perhaps some of these things aren't simply that governments shouldn't be making this decision, but a different level of government or a different committee or commission or what have you. And I should disclose that I myself am a DeSantis appointee. I'm on the Board of Trustees of Florida Polytechnic University. A type of diversity hire there, actually, because there's only 3 of us on the committee of 13 that don't have STEM backgrounds. So.
Do we, as classical liberals, old school liberals, conservatives, what you will, do we cede too much ground here? I mean, you left for very good reason, but you said, I don't want to deal with this. I watched some of these people in front of Congress, and I think I would last one meeting in a room with you and I would leave. But when we leave, we hand power to the people we're sitting criticizing. It's funny, if you look back, as you will all know, at the history of the left's march through these institutions, they telegraphed it. It sounds like a conspiracy theory until you actually read the documents. The Port Huron statement is just, they say, well, we're going to take over the universities because they're really influential and powerful, and that will help us. And then they did it. And we criticized them for having done so. Do we, outside of, obviously, present company, I mean, do we just need to do the same thing? Do we need to have more people who are prepared to stick it out and suck it up and insinuate themselves into these positions and take them over?
I'm a big tent, all of the above person on most things. And so it was the right call for me to leave, because I was hired to be both an inward-facing and outward-facing exponent teacher of originalism at the Center for the Constitution. And based on this report, again, that I got from the diversity office at Georgetown, I couldn't do that, because I wrote my resignation letters public. I summarized it in the Wall Street Journal, as one does when one resigns. You don't have to come up with far-fetched hypotheticals to see that my mere commentary on hot-button Supreme Court cases, purely within my professional wheelhouse, would have gotten me in hot water. Again, I couldn't do the job that I was hired to do. Now, that doesn't mean that Keith Whittington shouldn't have taken the job at Yale or should have resigned from Princeton because the institutions are hopeless. I'm not preternaturally an academic. I kind of straddle the legal, political, academic, and media worlds. I've managed to make a living doing that, which is great. But those who have a calling to be an academic, more power to them to work within these institutions. But we should also have parallel institutions. The University of Austin just opened its doors to its first class this month. That's tremendous. Or other centers within existing universities. The Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. There's one well-known one at Arizona State, University of North Carolina. These centers are cropping up for the purpose that universities are supposed to be doing, to actually teach excellence and civics and all of these wonderful things. So all of these are valid solutions. There can be other things as well, accreditation reform. In the legal space, the ABA has a monopoly on accreditation. That's really bad. Any monopoly would be really bad. The ABA itself is bad, so that should be changed. But different strokes for different folks. And so, yes, Charlie, we should. Some of us should leave. Some of us should stay. Some of us should start parallel institutions. Some of us should keep writing.
Are we winning? Are we making progress? I certainly see a lot less satisfaction with higher education in polls than was the case 20 or 30 years ago. Are they destroying themselves, or are they still hugely powerful?
There are indications that market forces are having an effect, such that University of Florida, for example, has been drawing students away from other schools. The SEC schools in general, the Southeastern Conference. Well, the old Southeastern Conference. Now there's two football conferences in the country. The Big Ten has 87 members. The Pac-12 has 2 members. It's very confusing. But anyway, the old kind of southern state schools are gaining advantage because whether they're COVID policies, whether they're academic freedom policies or otherwise, whether they're reactions to the pro-Hamas protests and all this, people are voting with their feet. So at the margins, there are certainly competitors. Vanderbilt, the chancellor of Vanderbilt has become a name now simply for ejecting students that violently took over his office. That's what passes for academic leadership these days, just enforcing your own rules, right? I don't know. Too soon to tell. We're in the eye of the storm. Some institutions are probably hopeless, but some can be changed. Elena Kagan, when she was dean of Harvard Law School, made a lot of changes, some relating to academic freedom and diversity of thought, some relating to just the student experience. So it takes good leaders often. These institutions are not very big. And what I've learned is it doesn't take very much to force change, in the sense that, to mix metaphors, a lot of these structures are Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. My new colleague at the Manhattan Institute, John Saylor, who's an investigative reporter, he uses FOIA very effectively. About a year and a half ago, he got a bunch of documents from Texas Tech showing that they were hiring their biologists through diversity statements. That was their primary criterion for hiring. Wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed about this. The very next day, the president of Texas Tech said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. It's inappropriate. So, there's a lot of, that gives me some hope. I'm not quite optimistic, but I'm less pessimistic than I was 2 years ago when I left Georgetown.
What about affirmative action? You just mentioned a FOIA request that led to the revelation that colleges were hiring on the basis of immutable characteristics. That is now illegal.
Not just immutable characteristics. This is further. This is based on ideology. Do you subscribe to all of that, the illiberal postmodern stuff?
Right, sort of an oath.
Yes.
One of the problems that many people identified with the fall of affirmative action legally is that practically it's quite hard to enforce. Partly because people can lie about it, and they can say, no, these were the decisions that we came to irrespective of immutable characteristics. Partly because while it is very unpopular in the country at large, the people who are tasked with making those decisions still seem, almost to a man, to believe in it, and the press does as well. How much resistance do you expect to that decision at the college level?
Well, look, there's going to be a whole panel on this later at this conference, so I don't want to steal their thunder. Brown v. Board did not desegregate public schools in the South overnight. It took many more years, executive actions, more lawsuits. Same thing's going to happen here with respect to the massive resistance to ending racial preferences. We're seeing the first statistics of post-SFFA admissions. Some schools, their ethnic balance changes markedly. Some it doesn't. And it's kind of curious that Yale and Princeton, in their briefs before the Supreme Court in the case, said if we're not allowed to use these racial preferences, then our ratios are going to be completely skewed. We're not going to be admitting any black students. Lo and behold, in their first statistics after SFFA, they've barely changed. So either they were lying in their briefs or they're violating the law now. It's unclear. I mean, there is going to be future litigation once we find all this stuff. It's going to be discovery heavy. I'm sure the general counsel's offices is all over the admissions office not to put anything in writing and things like that. People criticize sometimes those of us who want colorblind meritocracy and all this, criticize John Roberts' opinion for saying that you can have personal statements that reflect responses to adversity or racism that you've encountered or things like this. But then in the very next paragraph, he says, but these and other metrics can't be used as proxies for the very same racial preferences. So it's all there, but it'll have to be fleshed out in future litigation.
I wonder if you have thoughts on the back and forth we've seen with due process on campus, where Betsy DeVos spent a few years writing a really good rule that was implemented, and then Joe Biden won the election and came in and got rid of it. And I must say, as a rule, I spend quite a lot of time trying to work out what the people who disagree with me think. I know a lot of people who disagree with me. I ask them. I can comprehend it and respect it in most cases. But this is actually an area where I am just baffled. I do not understand how you can hold the position that President Biden does on the question of due process for those who've been accused of sexual assault. To me, it just absolutely strikes at my conception of fairness and liberalism and what the West and America in particular is supposed to stand for. And yet, of all the pieces I've ever written in a mainstream newspaper, when I wrote this in USA Today, I got more hate mail than I've ever got. So there is a constituency out there that is very committed to the idea that we should deprive people who've been accused on a college campus in a way that you would never accept in other circumstances. So as someone who's baffled, do you know why this is such an obsession for them? I can't fathom it.
Well, I think it started under Obama with the Dear Colleague letter and various guidance, and then Trump reversed that, DeVos reversed that, and then Biden reversed that in turn. Part of this is the dysfunction of our court system in general in not holding Congress to account, the elimination of Chevron deference and other major questions doctrine and things in that regard might start turning that around. So we're not governed by the pen and the phone and the whipsawing every time there's a change of political control of the White House. But this particular example, I think it came out of the early Me Too movement. And most of these due process cases that people are up in arms about aren't about race. They're about sexual harassment or sexual assault or things like that. And my view on that is sexual assault should be left to the police and the justice system. These are adults that we're talking about. That should be handled. Other things, he said, she said, shouldn't even be a cause for investigation one way or another. Either you committed a crime or you hurt somebody's feelings that there's some misunderstanding. Again, if you got somebody drunk and took advantage, I don't know, the law exists for these sorts of things. We shouldn't be creating a whole new mini police on campus, and that obviates most of this debate over what the due process protections are. But yeah, it's really striking, and part of this is then you bring in the critical theory overlay that came in on top of the initial Dear Colleague letter, and there's the view that different people should have different rights, including due process rights, depending on where they are in the intersectional matrix of privilege.
Yeah, except it's not actually executed properly, because a disproportionate number of the people who are the victims of this are African American, and in other circumstances are held to be the victims of societal structures that, if you believe Ibram X. Kendi, which you shouldn't, are deliberate. And so this is, it baffles me.
Yeah.
All right.
One other thing I wanted to mention before we forget, and this kind of goes to a lot of things that we've been talking around, is that's one of the big obstacles to reform and change, and are things getting better, is the whole of government equity initiatives of the Biden administration, effectively burrowing in political commissars to every federal agency, department, subunit, what have you. So long after Biden's gone, whether Kamala Harris wins or loses, whenever the Republicans take over the executive branch again, if that ever happens, you'll have, it's going to be very hard to root out this, talk about the deep state, these illiberal theories of enforcement, whether in education, whether in the Department of Transportation. It's not all kind of headline-grabbing stuff, but this is possibly the most pernicious legacy of the modern political regime.
I want to finish with a couple practical questions. So you now have 173 children, right?
Four. Which,
Four.
Relative to secular metropolitan lawyers, is probably 173.
It's growing fast. The rate is impressive.
Well, we're very efficient. The last pregnancy produced twins. So.
Yeah. So,
today went to their first day of 2 mornings a week preschool. We took the pictures and everything. It's very cute. So very proud.
Well, actually, that's a perfect segue then. So eventually, they will be of college age. Do you want them to go? If you do, what would you look for in a college? What would you advise them?
Well, I'm very happy that my oldest is 8, so we won't have to be making college decisions for 9 or 10 years. Because right now, or last year, people asked me, I'm like, good luck, God bless you. I mean, because I think, my advice right now is to go to the honors college of a good state school, like a University of Florida or a UNC, or these places that have these honors colleges or civic centers and things like this. Easy for me to say, I have an Ivy degree and all of that, but in 10 years, hopefully the choices will be a little more, a little better.
No, you see, you are optimistic. You're more optimistic than you admit to. 10 years is a good horizon. That's 2.5 presidencies. And if you were a dictator for a day, I can't run for president anyway, so I haven't just ruined it. I'm constitutionally prohibited.
Neither can I.
Yeah, exactly. We're both forbidden. But if you were dictator for a day and you could make one change based on what you've seen while at Georgetown and then in writing your book and the research you've done, what would you change? What is the biggest priority that you would dispense with?
I'm going to cheat and choose 2. One is dismantling all of the new bureaucratic offices that have been started at these schools in the last 10 years. And 2 is to enforce their existing policies. It's not wild and sexy. It's just getting rid of all of these these illiberal barnacles. And number 2 is their policies on paper are generally, most places, but places like Georgetown, Yale, all the schools that have been in the news have good policies on paper. But whether with respect to disruption of speakers or the encampments or harassment of students or what have you, they've simply not been enforced. And you can tell, Ben Sasse and the Chancellor of Diermeier, the Chancellor of Vanderbilt, got all these plaudits. All they were doing was enforcing their existing policies. Again, it's a very low bar for how to fix some of these things.
Can anyone force them to enforce those policies? Or is that
Title VI lawsuits? They have these policies, they refuse to enforce them to the detriment of certain types of students. Or to all students, for that matter.
How often is that done?
Well, in the last year, you've seen a lot of Title VI lawsuits, and there have already been settlements. I don't know what the terms of the settlement with NYU is, for example, but there seems to be progress. The Office of Civil Rights recently came to a resolution with the University of Illinois on remediation of anti-Semitism in various ways. Some of those things go in the wrong direction by, adding a Jewish component to DEI and having more anti-racism training and anti-Semitism training and stuff like this, which is not ultimately, I think, addressing the root cause of these issues. But there are, it's happening increasingly.
All right, well, thanks so much for listening, and thank you, Ilya Shapiro.
Thank you, Charlie.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Angela Morabito, and I'm the spokesperson for the Defense of Freedom Institute. Just 2 quick announcements right now, and the first is a big thank you to Charles and Ilya for a great conversation. And the second is that now we've got a break in our schedule, so we'll see you guys back here at 10:30 for our first plenary session.